Thank you so much for the Ohio Employee Ownership Center, Roy and Chris and everybody here to put a piece in your program about my father in the memorial that you just did. And also for recognizing me for this very important award, the John Logue Employee Ownership Excellence Award. My father was my inspiration and my shining light related to employee ownership. And as you can see from the video, which is his memorial service video, and we have employee ownership throughout, it was incredibly important to him. So you might have also seen that Michigan was really important to him as well. And Chris did me a favor, and he didn't edit out any of the Michigan content for this Ohio showing.
Tough. It was very hard.
We had a debate about it. I will summarize just a little bit about SEIC. I think it's important. In 1969, my father founded the company, and in the first year, they had $243,000 of revenue, and they were profitable. 2 decades later, in 1990, the company was $1 billion, and every year it had been profitable. 2004 is when he retired as chairman, and the company was just over $7 billion, and every year it had been profitable. There were, as Chris had mentioned, over 42,000 employee owners at that time. And for 33 years of the 35 years that my father was involved with the company, no one owned more than 2% of the company. No one owned more than 2% of the company. Over 80% of the wealth was owned in non-executives' hands. So it was pretty phenomenal, and part of, I think most of his business legacy is about the unconventional way that he ran that company. Okay, I'm gonna have to figure out a good way to do this. One is that he absolutely insisted that the company be employee owned. He demanded that the company be entrepreneurial and letting its employees do the things that they wanted to do and follow their passions. And that the employees focus on solving tough technical problems of national interest across a wide variety of the customer base. So my career journey was very much different than my father. In fact, it had very little to do with employee ownership. In fact, I tried to keep my initial career journey quite separate from my father, and as far away as possible as I could be. Many of you have probably had the same type of journey. For the first 12 years of my career, I worked for technical consulting companies, and I focused in commercial work, so private sector work, and my father had only done government work. I'd also worked in organizations that, again, did technical work, and it turned out that most of them competed against my father's company. That was kind of an interesting phenomenon. And then I worked as a management consultant, a manager, and an executive. And although I viewed the profit sharing and the employee ownership, if we had it, the companies that I worked at, as important, I thought they were tactical compensation tools. And that was really kind of my perspective. I joined SEIC in 2000, and I learned something very different about employee ownership, that it was very much a strategic value, a core value of that company, and a philosophy of operating, so much more than a compensation strategy. I became president of the Foundation for Enterprise Development in 2005, and as Chris had mentioned, this was a nonprofit that my father had created to advance entrepreneurship and employee ownership, and he had created it in 1986. And I thought it was a part-time job, and in order to get the focus around where I thought the foundation should go, I started an evaluation process to look at where there were, what the state of employee ownership was, where there were gaps, and where there were improvement areas in research, education, practice, and in policy. And one of the first people that I spoke with was John Logue, and he was one of the experts that I was directed to. And like my father, John was not a yes or no kind of person. He was very much about the nuances of employee ownership. And we had extensive dialogue on how important it was to understand those nuances, and that there was a richness of research and education to be done in those areas. So questions about, well, how much is enough? or to what extent will that have an impact? When does it work well? When does it work best? And how does employee ownership evolve over the life of a company? Because employee ownership absolutely does evolve. So I learned during that period of evaluation that there were a lot of significant gaps. Employee ownership needs to be in the education system. Otherwise, what we're facing is underserved students. We have limited possibilities for the leading industry practices to be spread, and we're allowing inadequate policies to continue to be unchecked. So I determined this was not going to be a part-time job. Some of my reflections on the education system, I talked to Chris that it would be helpful for me to share what we think are the gaps and what we've done and why, what do we think some of the results are so far. Employee ownership can be an essential element for an individual's advancement, for their prosperity, as well as for firm performance. And yet it's largely overlooked in university curriculum. So students are making decisions about equity compensation when they graduate, and they don't understand the range of equity, and they don't understand the value of equity. In addition, students are joining companies. They might be startups, they might be small and mid-sized companies, and they're given a very narrow perspective of what to expect. At business schools, typically you're taught about how to run a publicly held company. If you're a student, you've gone through an entrepreneurship program, typically what you're going to learn about is venture-backed companies and how to make exits. So it's a very narrow view of what to expect when you join the workforce. I commissioned a study in 2009 to look at business school cases in particular. And we reviewed over 30,000 business school cases, which is the main vehicle of teaching at a business school. And less than 1% of those cases even mention equity compensation, let alone employee-owned companies. Less than 1%. So ownership is also not just compensation, and it's not just a simple or a singular tool, not just a share, an option, or an ESOP. And unfortunately, more than 30 years of academic research has too narrowly defined employee ownership and its interrelated factors. But by seeking these narrow definitions, researchers had reduced employee ownership to tactics and tools rather than a business strategy, a philosophy, a core value, or the leadership practice that it can be. So the world of nuances has largely been lost in research, and consequently, employee ownership was not fully recognized, its potential and its impacts. And finally, another point that I recognized through this evaluation was there was a lack of academic infrastructure to even evolve the topic of ownership and put it in place of the evolving business and economic environment. So although there were very noble efforts in academia throughout the United States to do research, what there wasn't the weight of a cross-university infrastructure. There were no special interest groups in the leading academic associations, whether it be economics, sociology, management. None of that existed. And so what that means is that employee ownership isn't going to continue to be relevant in today's context and the different forms and the policies unless we have that infrastructure to support it, to keep it fresh. And also it would keep it mainstream in academia. So what we've done is I've tried to focus on programs that would create a vibrant research and education environment for awareness, for evidence, and for advanced practice. This has evolved over the last 10 years. I guarantee you it's going to continue to evolve, and I'll mention many of the programs, and I very much appreciate your feedback. So first, we established the Beyster Institute at the Rady School of Management at UCSD, and Martin Staubus is the executive director there. They teach equity compensation, employee ownership to second-year MBAs, also human resource management class to MBAs, and embed ownership in that discussion. They have a range of other services, but one of the things I wanted to highlight is they have a consulting service to companies that want to become employee-owned. And they have MBAs, usually 6 a year, that are interns in making those, in supporting those consulting assignments. Those interns are moving into employee-owned companies or into the professional services or into other industries, but they understand employee ownership now. And importantly, they all got jobs when they graduated. And every dean that you know will be incredibly pleased to hear that if you have an intern program and they're able to get jobs, that this is very highly successful. We also initiated a fellowship program. This is administered at Rutgers by Joseph Blasi, who, as you saw in the video, holds the endowed chair for employee ownership. And this started as a pilot program. We honestly didn't know who was going to apply, and the first year was oversubscribed. And that was 2009 was the first year that we received applications. Now there are over 100 fellows, and there's over 10 funders of those fellows, each with different focus areas. So there are funds for untenured faculty, which is really important, so they can advance their careers. And these professors now tell us they are studying employee ownership because of this funding that came in 1 year that they wouldn't have been able to do. And importantly, they're all continuing to study employee ownership even without additional funding coming in. And these areas of research are touching on the life cycle of many of the functional aspects of a company. How it affects recruiting when you say that you're an employee-owned company, the motivation elements, the sustainability and resilience of organizations, and different strategies in compensation. And there's many different aspects. There's over 25 disciplines that are participating in this fellowship program. Many of them are now starting to look into state and local and national policy development as well. We've worked with over 10 universities. I've worked the closest with MIT and with the University of Michigan to create cases and curriculum development. I'll highlight University of Michigan just for a moment because this is the first engineering school that we know of that has integrated employee ownership into the engineering program. And the reason is these are the inventors, and they want to understand ownership in general and equity compensation. So it's really been phrased under entrepreneurial ownership. And there's over 250 students that have gone through that program, both undergraduates and graduates, and it's still evolving. The tools sometimes, I get a little impatient with universities, so sometimes when we see a gap, we will do things ourselves at the foundation. So we wrote SEIC Solution and have written some other books. But the film was my personal passion. I spent 3 years on the film, producing the film, and then 2 years going out to universities and showing the film. We got into 8 film festivals, 2 awards. It's integrated into over 150 business school curriculum. Many of you and many employee-owned companies, over 150 employee-owned companies are using it for training. And importantly, we got it on the air, cable, and both a regional PBS station for creating more awareness about employee ownership. And that's exactly what the kind of feedback is that we've gotten. Some founders and CEOs are saying they're considering employee ownership because now they feel that it applies more to their workforce than they had thought before they saw the film. Some of the lessons, and I'll share this because I think I've already got the award, so even though there are some weaknesses.
We can always take it away.
You know, nothing's perfect. And so I think the research is really, really coming along. I think that's interdisciplinary. It's been the right approach. We've got amazing, talented people coming into this pool. They are academically strong in some of the best institutions we have. In fact, we've got 2 people here, Jackie Yates and Vernon Woodley, which I'd like you to stand and get acknowledged for the work that you've been doing in employee ownership. The area I think we need help on the research is translators. So this research needs to be in the language for academia in order for them to advance in their careers in academia, but we also need translators. The Ohio Employee Ownership Center has been one of those translators, NCEO and the ESOP Association as well, but to translate it into the language of practice and translate it into the language of policy. So that's a very big next step, I think, and in part when companies are participating with those fellowships, it shapes their questions, and that's also very helpful in translating what are the kind of most important things that you want to learn about how employee ownership works. We've got a lot of written materials. We have a curriculum library. It has 650 materials that are available for teaching. There's been 650,000 views since we put that curriculum library online with the Aspen Institute. And yet we still need stories. We need stories about when companies are at turning points, either at the beginning or as they're growing or face certain critical moments, how they thought through that. Those are important stories to have in that curriculum. So I welcome any participation in that regard. Film is it, folks. If you want to reach the next generation, it's storytelling and it's video. And we've definitely seen that with We the Owners, and I really encourage you to not do commercials, but do stories when you're capturing these stories of your firm's experience from your front line to your executives and blend those together. It's really the best way if someone doesn't work at your company to understand how it feels to be an employee owner. Direct influence in universities, I would encourage you, if you're an alumni, if you are an industry leader, if you're a community leader, or if you're a potential donor for a university, talk to your deans and your professors about what you need in your workforce, what you need for your leadership to advance, to run an employee-owned company, and for your governance of your company. They will listen. If they don't hear from you, they don't think there's a gap. And with that, I'd also say be a little bit liberal on the terms of employee ownership. I've often found when you say employee ownership, it seems like a thing of the past, sorry to say, but if it's viewed as just an ESOP or just an option, then it's maybe not adopted as broadly as an academic might be able to use. So that's why when I mentioned University of Michigan, they use entrepreneurial ownership. It's not a course just about employee ownership, but ownership is embedded with employee ownership being highlighted. So you might have terms like shared equity, inclusive capital, depending if you're talking with economists, or a range of other terms, and I'm more than willing to share you what terms I've seen. But I think if we just talk about employee ownership at the university level, you might get more pushback than we would need. Okay, so I'll just wrap on just saying, I didn't start my career in employee ownership. It's been a personal honor to be involved in this community. I mean, this is the sweetest community and tough. Employee ownership is, there's a nurturing side, but there's also a tough side of this, and I've been very honored to be part of this in an academic setting because we are asking tough questions. Employee ownership is not a panacea, and there's a lot of great potential, and it needs and should be in the educational system. The Employee Ownership Center here in Ohio are leaders and they're key role models and as scholars, so you really have a treasure here in Ohio and in the Midwest. Employee ownership for me is really directed not only towards corporate performance responsibility, it's a stewardship, and prosperity ties to opportunity and equal access to wealth that one creates. And ownership is really one of the key mechanisms for that prosperity, and yet is largely overlooked, as I've mentioned, in that equation. So ownership and employee ownership simply needs to be in the educational center and educational systems. And I would appreciate your feedback and your involvement in making that happen. Thank you.